Hello, everybody. Obviously, I am not here today, so I figured I'd use this time to keep pushing our way through the Great Depression with our notes. So last week, just a reminder. All right, so we talked about some of the impacts of the Great Depression. We have a lot of unemployed people, lots of unskilled laborers being laid off. We have a lot of homelessness going on. Okay, a high of 25% of Americans are unemployed, and we have quite a few that are homeless. All right, we have shanty towns popping up everywhere called Hoovervilles. All right, so they named Hoovervilles after President Hoover because they wanted to blame him for the Great Depression. All right, and if you remember from last week, we took a look at these. All right, they were either going to be in public places like parks. You also had a lot near railroads because you had mainly men looking for jobs jumping on and off railroads, and therefore they would build these Hoovervilles near the railroad because it was a source of transportation from getting from one place to another. All right, we need to talk today about some of the impacts on society the Great Depression had. We're also going to talk about the Dust Bowl today, and then we're going to finish up with the 1932 election. So we do have quite a bit to get through today. All right. And then when you are done watching this video, you should be working on your Netflix binge project that you guys started last week. That is due on the 15th. So not this Thursday, but next Thursday. All right. So let's get started. So poverty straining society. So because people didn't have a whole lot of money, the majority of people, we see a lot of malnutrition going on in the 19th, or especially the early 1930s during the Great Depression. Now, some people starved, and thousands of people, including children, went hungry. Now, if you as a child who's continuing to grow, especially kids especially suffered long-term effects of a poor diet and just inadequate medical care. So if you don't get enough calories, not only can it stunt your growth, but you can actually get quite a few diseases of malnourishment. One that was probably the most common was this disease called rickets. All right, rickets not only stunted your growth, but your bones could actually wind up growing not in a way that it should. All right, so rickets can cause a lot of deformations of children. You also see, especially young kids when they're getting their new teeth. When their teeth fall out, you need that nutrition in order to keep your teeth healthy. And if you don't have that nutrition, it's just not a good thing for you. All right, so major impacts of health for young people. All right, we also see stresses on families. I alluded to this last week. So living conditions in general just declined for families. We see almost like living conditions like pre-progressive eras. So if you remember looking at those tenement houses at the very beginning of the school year, and we showed 9 men living in one apartment, and there was no windows, and people were going in the bathroom in a bucket. Living conditions went way down from where they were almost back to that point pre-progressive era. All right, now men. Because men during the 1930s were seen as the major breadwinner of the family, wound up actually feeling very guilty for not being able to provide for their families. And because they were feeling guilty, you actually saw some men just abandoning families in general. All right, almost like, I don't want to say they're running away from their problems, but they're definitely... we saw a lot of mental health problems during the 1930s because of this. We also see women being discriminated against, women that were able to hold on to their jobs were being discriminated against by not only other women but men because they believed that these women were taking away jobs from men who were the breadwinners of their families. So you see a lot of discrimination, not only with women, but you also see discrimination with minorities. So like African Americans, Hispanic people, Asian Americans, and so minority groups that still had jobs wound up taking a brunt of the anger because many white Americans believed that these minority groups were taking their jobs and they couldn't provide for their families, and therefore they lashed out, and sometimes they lashed out violently. So lynchings in the late 1920s, early 1930s increased, and aid programs actually discriminated against African Americans as well. So prior to 1933, before welfare programs took over during the New Deal, a lot of the programs that were set up to take care of people actually just went through churches, and these aid programs wound up discriminating against a lot of minority groups. All right, the Dust Bowl. All right, the Dust Bowl, okay, really affected everywhere in this large oval, but it was the worst in this small circle here. All right, this area was by far the worst part of the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl was a severe drought, so meaning no rain. We have overgrazing by cattle and overplowing by farmers. All of these, and if you remember last week, I talked a little bit about crop rotation as well, especially in third hour. I haven't quite gotten there till sixth hour. All right, crop rotation just means that you're growing the same crop over and over and over again in the same field, and then ultimately, because that crop only takes out certain nutrients out of the ground, it winds up killing off the ground. Okay, that topsoil that you need in order to grow food. All right, so overproduction, all right, or overplowing by farmers. You have a severe drought, all right, so no rain coming in these areas. Overgrazing by cattle, so they're actually eating up all of these grasses that actually held the soil together. And then ultimately, all of these things together and these high winds wind up blowing away all of this topsoil. All right. Now these storms were actually called black blizzards, and that's a picture of it right down there. That's just a huge dust storm that's coming towards these houses. Now parts of the Great Plains, this area right here, okay, that circle, became known as the Dust Bowl. All right. Now because these farmers weren't able to produce anything on this land, you see a lot of they were eventually became known as Okies because you had a lot of people from Oklahoma, because if you take a look at this map, all right, a good portion of Oklahoma is in it. You see a lot of people from Oklahoma wind up moving away from Oklahoma and going to California looking for jobs. That's what the book The Grapes of Wrath is all about. Now, just like these minority groups that took a brunt of, and women that took a brunt of the anger of not being able to find a job, you also have these farmers that moved away from this area into California looking for jobs wind up taking a lot of discrimination as well, because they were seen as competition for the people that already lived in this area. All right, and the term that they were given was Okies. It was considered almost like a derogatory term. It wasn't very nice. All right, so here's a picture. All right, this is just an idea of what the dust storm is. Now, it kind of looks like snow, but it's actually sand. So once you blow away all that topsoil, all that nutritious soil, you wind up only getting like a desert. All right, so you have these areas that used to be super fertile wind up looking like just a desert, like you're stuck on a desert island. All right, you're stuck in the Sahara. All right, so this is actually what Oklahoma looked like. Okay, this is a dust storm over Texas. All right, and these dust storms moved really fast because they moved with the wind. So if you saw a dust storm coming, you better get your butt inside because it gets so dark in a dust storm that a lot of people wound up getting lost outside in a dust storm, and you could actually suffocate from breathing in those dust particles, because when you're breathing in dust particles, it's actually tearing up. It can create these little holes in your lungs, and if you allow that to happen for too long, you can actually get this. You can get pneumonia and wind up dying from that. All right, here is a dust storm in Kansas. Okay, you can see this family right here running away from the dust storm and trying to get into this little hideout. All right, that was probably also used for tornadoes. All right, now as you can see, there's not a whole lot of windows going on these buildings. It was to try to keep as much dust out as possible. All right, and now obviously they weren't very successful at that because they didn't have the insulation like we have now. It was mainly just boards and some wax paper if you had it. All right, now who did the drought hit the hardest? Definitely these migrant workers. All right, so mainly Oklahoma people. All right, and some people from Arkansas actually headed west, like I said, to escape the Dust Bowl. All right, so they would pack up everything they had, they threw it in their Model T, and they would drive west. Now, many were not welcomed by the locals, like I said, because the locals feared that these migrants were coming in to take these local jobs. And because of that, they were not welcomed and they weren't helped in these areas either. So when they would finally get out to California, a lot of them, because they used all of their money to get out there and they weren't paid very well if they were able to work in California, wound up living in just these poor conditions. So you can see here that this family is actually just living in this tent. All right, so they have all their belongings. It's an open face tent, and that's where they're living. This woman right here is sitting in her Model T. I don't know if she's waiting for somebody or if that's her living situation. All right, now the living situation, tents. There's no water, electricity, no plumbing. Okay, no kitchen really. It was very, very hard on these people. All right. So, in conclusion, how the drought and the dust storms compound Depression era problems? So, number one, we have farmers were already struggling prior to this. So, if you remember in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s didn't really affect farmers because of overproduction. So, they got hit with the Depression before everybody else did. The lack of rain and just the overuse of land made problems for farmers even worse. All right, it's not like when you're going into areas. Into farming areas now where you see these giant irrigation systems. It's not like they had those. Okay, they were very dependent on rain, and if you didn't have it and you were continuing to try to farm, you were going to wind up ruining your land. Now, these conditions wind up forcing farmers from the Great Plains, and you need to know that these farmers that were forced from the Great Plains wound up moving west. All right. Now, we do have some signs of change going into the 1930s, all right? So first and foremost, we have the 21st Amendment getting passed in 1933, so after the 1932 election, which repealed Prohibition. As if you guys remember from last unit, which I hope you do, Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was not successful, all right? It was impossible to enforce, and really it just made organized crime that much stronger. So in 1933, with the 21st Amendment, they got rid of the 18th. We also see the Empire State Building getting built, which ultimately became the largest building for quite a long time, with 102 stories. It It was great because 2,500 to 4,000 people were able to work on the construction, so it was putting people back to work, and ultimately cost about $41 million to build, which went right in those construction workers' pockets, which is really good. All right, and ultimately we have the end of the era. All right, meaning the end of the 1920s, Roaring Twenties. It just kind of faded away with the Great Depression. So Al Capone went to prison. All right, 21st Amendment. Calvin Coolidge, our president from 1924 to 1928, prior to Herbert Hoover, wound up dying, and Babe Ruth retired, kind of bookending the end of the 1920s era, going into the 1930s, the Great Depression era. All right, so we have the election of 1932. All right, now leading up to the election of 1932, we see people pulling together and helping out their neighbors. All right, those people wound up seeing their neighbors and saw some people actually worse off than themselves. So Americans pulled together and tried to help one another. All right, one way in particular was these things called penny auctions. So banks, because banks were seen as the bad guy, because the banks wound up loaning out people's money to speculators to invest in the stock market, or just investing in the stock market themselves and wind up losing all these people's money. So banks actually wound up foreclosing on farms because farmers couldn't pay their mortgage. And when banks foreclose on buildings, they need to sell them, all right, in order to try to make their money back. So a lot of times they would have auctions for this farmland. So on these auction days, all of the neighbors, neighborhood farmers would gather, and instead of fighting over this land, they would hold these things called penny auctions. So the bank would come out, they would start this auction off, and people would only put up pennies to buy this land, and very, very minuscule amount, and they would actually wound up buying the land and giving it back to the farmers that got it foreclosed on. So it was kind of sticking it to the banks. All right. Now, some Americans no longer liked what was going on with Herbert Hoover and the way that he was running things. They wanted radical political and economic change. They believed that that we needed a fair distribution of wealth. So if you remember, in the 1920s, we see the rich getting richer, we see the poor getting poorer, and we see not much of a middle class anymore. And because of that, people are frustrated. People don't like just seeing, your top 1% holding all of the money. All right. Now, Hoover. When Hoover became president in 1928, going into 1929, he kind of ran the same way that Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge ran things. He believed in hands-off economics. He didn't think that the government should be involved. And he kind of tried to do the same thing when the Great Depression hit. He believed that the market would ultimately fix it. And then by the time he realized that just wasn't the case, everything was just too far gone. All right. So let's take it from the beginning. All right. So stock market crashes. In order to try to get people to buy American-made goods, to try to bolster the American economy, Congress and Herbert Hoover wind up passing the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which we've already talked about in class. All right, which was the highest tax on imports in American history. This turns out to be a really bad idea, because yes, it's good because Americans are able to go out and buy American goods, but we have globalization. All right, so European countries turn right around and they raise tariffs on international trade. So yeah, we're selling more American goods in our country, but we're selling far less around the world. So it didn't really help our economy at all. All right. Then Hoover set up this thing called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which winds up giving out government credit to banks, industries, and railroads and insurance companies. Now, this credit is money. All right, so essentially it's a bailout. Now, the theory was, hey, if we give money to all of these people at the top, it's ultimately going to trickle down to everybody, because if the people at the top that run these industries have cash, they're going to go out and they're going to hire people and they're going to make goods, and then those people now have money in their pocket, so they're able to go out and buy goods, and our economy will get moving again. However, all right, many Americans just saw this as the government helping bankers and big businessmen, while ordinary people went hungry. So it was extremely unpopular, and ultimately it just didn't work. All right, a lot of these businesses didn't really put out the amount of products and hire enough workers to really make a difference with this bailout that they got. Now, Hoover did not support the federal public assistance, so like a welfare program. He believed that it would destroy the people's, and this is how he said it, self-respect. All right, so people getting help from the government would ultimately take away their self-respect and make our government too big. He believed that if you needed help, you needed to go to essentially a church, and a church would help you. But as we talked about earlier, we have churches only helping, or not just churches, but just organizations that help people in general were discriminating against minority groups. And then finally, the straw that broke the camel's back on Hoover's presidency was this thing called the bonus army. Now, Hoover, when he wound up taking over after World War I had ended, the men that fought in World War I were actually promised a bonus in, I believe it was 1945, I want to say. Well, ultimately, these 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans wound up marching on the U.S. Capitol because they wanted their bonus earlier. All right? Hoover said, no, you're not getting it. And not only did he say no, but he actually sent in the National Guard to break up what was known as the bonus army. So it was a public relations nightmare. It looked terrible. It looked like our government was attacking veterans. Didn't look good. All right, which led us into the 1932 election. We have FDR. All right, now Herbert Hoover ran against FDR. All right, FDR believed that the government had a responsibility to help people in need. Now, FDR was the governor of New York prior to becoming president of the United States. FDR also had polio as an adult. And polio as an adult was supposed to be deadly, but he actually survived, but it did leave him paralyzed from the waist down. All right. So when he was running in 1932, because there was such a stigma about people that had really anything quote unquote different about them, he actually tried to keep it as hidden as possible. So when he would go out on stage, in order to keep him upright, he actually had metal braces put on his legs so he would be able to stand up at the podium. Now, when he was running for president in 1932, he called for this thing called the New Deal, which we'll talk about more on Wednesday. All right. He called for the reappraisal of values and more controls over big businesses, so making the government larger. All right, more oversight. It's no more laissez-faire economics. No more businesses being able to what people saw was get away with everything. They wanted to help Americans reassess the importance of, quote unquote, making it on their own without any help. Okay, realizing that there needs to be some type of safety net, and that's what FDR was creating. He created, with the help of Congress, an extremely large safety net for people down on their luck. All right. Now, much of his supporters wind up coming from urban areas, so unskilled workers. So if you remember, all of our factories are in large urban areas, coal miners, and immigrants, all right, in need of federal relief. And because of this, Roosevelt winds up winning 57% of the popular vote, and almost 90 or 89% of the electoral vote. And it was a landslide. All right. It was not even close. All right. So we are done with notes for today. On Wednesday, like I said, we're going to have to do more notes on Wednesday. I got to talk you through the New Deal and exactly what it was and what it did. All right. But the rest of the day, you should be working on your Netflix binge project on Google Classroom. Okay. All right. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.